It was a bitterly cold morning in the winter of 1967 when I first set foot in the Rosenheim law office. The air inside was heavy, filled with a silence that was almost unnatural for a place of business. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I had been called in to assist with a rather peculiar situation, one that had the entire office in a state of panic. What I witnessed there still haunts me to this day. It all started innocuously enough. The telephones began to ring, not just once or twice, but incessantly. Every phone in the office would suddenly come to life, ringing simultaneously with no caller on the other end. No matter how many times we answered, the line would be dead, the hollow sound of the dial tone echoing in our ears. At first, the staff shrugged it off as a technical glitch, but as the days passed, the frequency of these calls increased, and with it, an overwhelming sense of dread. The strange occurrences didn't stop at the phones. Lights flickered at odd intervals, sometimes plunging the entire office into darkness, leaving us groping in the void until the flickering bulbs begrudgingly sparked back to life. I remember one evening, late after most of the staff had gone home. I was working alone when the lights began to pulse erratically. Each flash revealed something different. A chair slightly out of place, a stack of papers scattered across the floor, and once, I swear, the shadow of a figure standing just beyond my reach. The staff had their own stories, whispered in hushed tones over coffee breaks. Files went missing only to reappear in odd places. Drawers opened and closed by themselves, and the once orderly office now felt like it was spiraling into chaos. But the worst was yet to come. One particularly unnerving day, I was in the main office when the telephone on the reception desk began to ring. I watched frozen as the receiver slowly lifted itself off the cradle and hung in midair before crashing down onto the floor. The sound shattered the eerie quiet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The rest of the staff had witnessed it too, their faces pale and wide-eyed, as if they were seeing a ghost for the first time. It was around this time that I began to notice her. One of the clerks, a quiet and unassuming young woman always at her desk, always seemingly lost in her work. At first, there was nothing unusual about her, but the more I observed, the more I realized she was often present during the most intense disturbances. Whenever she was near, the air grew colder and the activity seemed to ramp up. One afternoon, I decided to approach her, to ask if she had noticed anything strange, if she had seen or heard the same things we all had. But as I drew closer, something in her eyes stopped me dead in my tracks. There was a darkness there, something unsettling, as if she was looking right through me. It was then that I began to suspect that the disturbances weren't just random, that perhaps they were somehow connected to her. That night I stayed late, determined to figure out what was going on. As the office emptied, the familiar tension returned, heavier than ever before. The lights dimmed and flickered, the silence almost suffocating. And then, without warning, the door to the main office slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. I jumped, my heart racing, as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. But when I looked, there was no one there. I returned to my desk, my nerves frayed, only to find a message scrawled in red ink across a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. It was a single word, and it sent a cold wave of terror through me. Run! As I stared at the word, trying to make sense of it, the lights went out completely. The office was plunged into darkness, the only sound the frantic beating of my own heart. Then, out of the darkness, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so close it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, but all I saw was the faint outline of a figure, slowly moving towards me. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure stepped into the dim light seeping through the windows, and I realized with horror that it was her, the clerk, her eyes now black as coal, her expression twisted into something inhuman. She raised a hand, and the furniture around me began to shake violently. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and I felt the floor beneath me begin to tremble. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on. The growl faded into silence, and she was gone. The office was still, as if nothing had happened, but the message on my desk remained, a chilling reminder of the terror I had just experienced. I knew then that this was no ordinary poltergeist. Something far more sinister was at play, something that was only just beginning to reveal itself. And whatever it was connected to her. But the worst part, this was only the beginning. After that night, the atmosphere in the Rosenheim office grew more oppressive with each passing day. The staff, once busy and focused, now moved through the halls like shadows, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion. Conversations were sparse, eyes darted nervously, and everyone avoided the young clerk as if she carried a contagious disease. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one who truly understood the depth of the darkness that had taken hold of our workplace. The events escalated rapidly. It began with the clocks. Every single one in the office started to spin wildly. hands moving so fast they blurred, until they all stopped at exactly the same time, 3:15 p.m. The power of that moment was so intense, we could feel it in our bones. I watched in stunned silence as the clerk sat at her desk, oblivious to the chaos, her gaze fixed on some distant point. Then came the shadows. They would flit across the walls, darting in and out of the corners of my vision, too quick to be fully seen, but always there, lingering. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My colleagues began to murmur about the strange shapes, claiming they'd seen figures standing in the corners of rooms, only to vanish when approached. One day, as I was retrieving some files from the archive room, I caught a glimpse of one of those shadows. It was more defined, more human-like, but twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. It moved closer, and for a brief, horrifying moment I thought it was going to reach out and touch me. The tension in the office reached a breaking point when one of the secretaries, a woman named Mrs. Richter, had a breakdown. She had been working late, the office nearly empty, when she suddenly began screaming. By the time I reached her, she was cowering under her desk, shaking violently and babbling incoherently about the faces. Her terror was palpable, and it took hours to calm her down enough to speak. Through her sobs, she told us that she had seen something in the reflection of her computer screen. Faces. Dozens of them. All staring back at her with hollow, empty eyes. They were grinning, she said, their mouths stretched too wide, as if they were mocking her. The sight had driven her to the edge, and by the end of the week, she had quit, refusing to set foot in the office again. That night, I decided to investigate further. I stayed behind after everyone else had gone home, determined to get to the bottom of the disturbances. As the clock ticked closer to 3:15 p.m., I could feel the air grow thick with anticipation. I made my way to the clerk's desk, noticing the way the shadows seemed to cling to her, as if drawn to her presence. She was there as always, her head bent over a stack of papers, her hands trembling slightly. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched at every sound, no matter how small. There was something wrong with her, something deeply unsettling. I reached out, intending to touch her shoulder, to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. But before I could make contact, the lights flickered, and the office was plunged into darkness once again. This time it was different. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was tangible, suffocating, pressing in on all sides. I could hear the sound of breathing, heavy and labored, as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers shaking, but when the lights finally flickered back on, the office had changed. The furniture was overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and the clerk? She was standing in the middle of the room, her back to me, her hands hanging limply at her sides. A low humming sound filled the air, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. I watched in horror as the clerk slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were black, like twin voids, sucking in all the light around them. Her mouth was twisted into that same grotesque grin Mrs. Richter had described, stretched too wide, almost as if it were splitting her face in half. The humming reached a fever pitch, vibrating through my skull, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office, now eerily still. When I looked back, the clerk was gone. The only trace of her, a single sheet of paper fluttering to the ground. I picked it up with trembling hands. The message scrawled on it was in the same red ink as before, but this time it wasn't a single word. It was a question, one that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Do you see them? I crumpled the paper in my fist, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I was in way over my head. Whatever was plaguing the Rosenheim office, it was more than just a poltergeist. It was something ancient, something malevolent, and it had chosen her as its conduit. As I left the office that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever was tormenting us was growing stronger, feeding off our fear. And I knew deep down that this was far from over. The worst was yet to come. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and nerve-wracking days. The office had become a living nightmare, a place where the line between reality and madness was growing increasingly blurred. The strange occurrences that had once been intermittent now became a constant, gnawing presence that none of us could escape. Even at home, I found no relief. My sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares, always the same. The young clerk standing at the foot of my bed, her black eyes boring into me, her mouth twisted into that unnatural grin. I tried to avoid her during the day, but it seemed impossible. No matter where I went in the office, she was there, always on the periphery of my vision, always watching. The others noticed it too. Her presence had become a source of quiet terror among the staff. Her once overlooked existence now a dark specter that none of us could shake. And then, things took a turn for the worse. It was a Tuesday, just after lunch. I was in the break room trying to collect myself when I heard it. A scream, sharp and panicked, echoing down the corridor. I rushed out, heart pounding, and found a small group of employees gathered outside the main office. They were staring at the door, which was shut tight, the frosted glass rattling as if something, or someone, was throwing themselves against it from the other side. "What's going on?" I demanded, but no one answered. They were all too transfixed by the sight before them. I pushed through the crowd, my mind racing with possibilities. I knew the clerk was inside, had seen her enter just minutes before, but now there was no sound from within, only the rhythmic banging against the door, like something was trying to break free. Without thinking, I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. The scene that greeted me was nothing short of horrifying. The furniture was overturned, chairs and desks scattered haphazardly across the room. Papers were strewn everywhere, fluttering in the cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. But the most disturbing sight was the clerk herself. She was standing in the center of the room, her back arched at an unnatural angle, her limbs contorted as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. Her mouth hung open, emitting a low, guttural moan that reverberated through the walls. I was frozen, unable to move as I watched her body jerk and twitch, her eyes rolling back into her head. And then, with a final, violent convulsion, she collapsed to the floor, limp and unresponsive. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as the other employees slowly backed away, whispering among themselves. I hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, my heart thudding in my chest as I knelt beside her. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, and for a brief moment I feared she was dead. But then she took a shallow, shuddering breath, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze was unfocused, distant, as if she was looking right through me. I reached out, cautiously, to touch her arm, but as soon as my fingers made contact with her skin, she jerked away, her eyes locking onto mine with a ferocity that made my blood run cold. "Don't touch me!" she hissed, her voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with such venom that I recoiled instinctively. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as if the very act of standing was exhausting. The other employees continued to watch, their expressions a mix of fear and pity, but no one moved to help. She shot them all a withering glare before stumbling out of the room, leaving an eerie silence in her wake. The tension in the office was unbearable after that. Everyone was on edge, jumpy at the slightest sound, and the clerk became even more isolated. No one dared speak to her, and she, in turn, avoided all contact, retreating into herself as the days passed. But the disturbances didn't stop. In fact, they grew more frequent, more violent. One afternoon, as I was working at my desk, the lights flickered once again, but this time, they didn't come back on. The office was plunged into darkness, and for a few moments the only sound was the collective intake of breath from my colleagues. Then out of the silence came a loud crash, followed by another scream. I jumped up, my pulse racing, and made my way towards the sound, guided only by the dim light filtering in from the windows. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. A large bookshelf had toppled over, pinning one of the clerks beneath it. The others were trying frantically to lift it, their faces pale with fear. But what drew my attention wasn't the fallen bookshelf. It was the shadows, dozens of them, darting across the walls, coalescing around the clerk who was pinned to the floor. They moved in a frenzy, like a swarm of insects, and as I watched, horrified, they began to take shape. Faces. Dozens of faces, just as Mrs. Richter had described, their mouths wide in grotesque grins, their eyes hollow and dead. They circled around the pinned clerk, their silent laughter echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until I thought I might go mad from the sound. I forced myself to look away, to focus on helping the others lift the bookshelf. But as we did, I caught a glimpse of something else, something that made my blood run cold. The young clerk was standing in the doorway, her expression blank, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. But there was something different about her now, something that hadn't been there before. A darkness, like a shadow that clung to her, warping the air around her, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the darkness receded, and she was gone, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my gut. We managed to lift the bookshelf, pulling the injured clerk free. She was shaken, but thankfully not seriously hurt. But as we helped her to her feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all in grave danger. That whatever was happening wasn't just a haunting, it was a possession. And the young clerk, the one who had once been so quiet, so unassuming, was at the center of it all. That night, I decided to confront her. I waited until everyone else had left, then made my way to her desk. She was there, as always, her head bent over her work, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around her. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "What are you?" She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence. But then, in a voice so cold it sent a shiver down my spine, she replied, "I'm not the one you should be afraid of." Before I could respond, the lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in the air, feel the ice creeping into my bones. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just behind me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office, silent and still. When I looked back at the clerk, she was staring at me. Her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. Pity, perhaps. Or maybe just a resigned acceptance of what was to come. "You should have run when you had the chance," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own racing thoughts. And in that moment, I knew she was right. But it was too late. The darkness had already taken hold, and there was no escaping it now. Whatever was haunting the Rosenheim office wasn't done with us yet. The real terror was only just beginning. The next day, I arrived at the office with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in weeks. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my resolve, but it was tempered by a growing conviction that there had to be a way to end this nightmare. I spent the morning researching, poring over books on paranormal activity, hauntings, and possessions. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. As I read, I began to piece together a theory, one that linked the young clerk to the disturbances but also offered a glimmer of hope. The manifestations seemed to be focused around her, but they were also spiraling out of control, as if whatever force was behind them was growing stronger, feeding off the fear and chaos it created. It dawned on me that perhaps she wasn't the source of the malevolence, but rather its victim, an unwilling conduit for something far darker. By noon, I had a plan. It was risky, and I wasn't entirely sure it would work, but I had to try. I couldn't bear the thought of another day trapped in that oppressive atmosphere, or of the clerk, who, I now realized, was as much a prisoner as the rest of us, suffering any longer. I waited until the office was nearly empty, until the shadows began to lengthen, and the familiar chill settled over the rooms. The young clerk was still at her desk, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she was fighting against some unseen force. I approached her cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "Listen to me," I said quietly, leaning in so that only she could hear. "I know you're not doing this on purpose. I think something is using you, something that's trying to take over. But I believe we can stop it. You just have to trust me." For a long moment she didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the papers in front of her, her expression unreadable. But then slowly she nodded. "What do I need to do?" she whispered, her voice tinged with both fear and a faint glimmer of hope. I explained my plan as quickly and clearly as I could. We needed to confront whatever was inside her, whatever had been wreaking havoc on the office, and force it to leave. It would require all of her strength, all of her willpower to resist it. I would be there to help, but ultimately it was a battle only she could fight. We made our way to the center of the office, the place where the disturbances had always been the most intense. The lights flickered ominously as we stood together, and I could feel the temperature drop, the familiar oppressive atmosphere closing in around us. "Focus," I told her, gripping her hand tightly. "You have to concentrate, don't let it control you." She nodded, closing her eyes, and began to breathe deeply, slowly, trying to center herself. I watched as the shadows in the room began to coalesce, gathering around us like a dark cloud. The air grew thick, heavy, and I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on us. The clerk's breathing quickened, her hand trembling in mine, but she didn't falter. "I won't let you take me," she whispered, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not yours." The room seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows swirling faster, and I could feel the force within her fighting back, trying to assert its control. But she held firm, her grip on my hand tightening as she focused all of her strength on pushing it out. Then, suddenly, there was a deafening crash, and the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound the frantic beating of my heart. I could feel the presence growing stronger, more aggressive, and for a moment, I feared we were losing the battle. But then, from deep within the darkness, a light began to grow. It was faint at first, barely more than a flicker, but it gradually intensified, pushing back the shadows. I looked over at the clerk, and to my astonishment, I saw that the light was coming from her, emanating from deep within her chest, spreading outwards, banishing the darkness that had taken hold of the office. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "You have no power over me!" With a final surge of will, she pushed back the presence that had been haunting her. The shadows recoiled, writhing as if in pain, and then, with a sound like a gust of wind, they were gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm, of peace, that I hadn't felt in weeks. The lights flickered back on, steady and bright, and the office was quiet. Eerily quiet, but in a way that felt right, as if it was finally at rest. The young clerk swayed slightly, and I caught her as she stumbled, exhausted but victorious. "You did it," I whispered, relief flooding through me. "It's over." She looked up at me, her eyes no longer dark and haunted but clear and bright. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude and a newfound strength. I couldn't have done it without you. Over the next few days, the office returned to normal. The disturbances stopped completely, and the atmosphere lightened. The staff, once terrified and on edge, began to relax, their laughter and chatter returning as the memories of the past few weeks faded into the background. The young clerk, once so quiet and withdrawn, became more confident, more at ease. She even started smiling, genuine warm smiles that lit up her face. Whatever darkness had plagued her was gone, and in its place was a sense of peace and hope. As for me, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The nightmares stopped and the office became just another place to work, no longer a house of horrors. But more than that, I had gained something invaluable. A deeper understanding of the strength that lies within all of us, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. We never spoke of the events again, not in any detail, but we all knew, deep down, that we had been through something extraordinary, something that had changed us all. And as I looked around the office, at the smiling faces of my colleagues, and the bright, cheerful atmosphere, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what we had overcome. The Rosenheim Poltergeist, as it would later be known, became a story told in whispers, a legend that faded into the annals of paranormal history. But for those of us who were there, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is always light to be found, and that sometimes the most powerful force of all is the courage to face our fears head on.